Hello and good morning. My name is Fiona Agombar and I'd like to first of all welcome you to my sitting room where I'm doing this recording. And I live in Southsea, which is near Portsmouth in the south of England. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining me this morning. And I'm going to do my best to share some ideas and tips with you about how we can help people who've got energy issues, particularly looking at burnout, overwhelm, and chronic fatigue syndrome, or as we call it in England, ME. So first of all, I'd just like to say a little bit about myself and explain who I am and why I have an interest in this subject. I had ME, we call it ME in the UK, for something like 15 years. So I became ill in 1990 after running a very busy and hectic public relations business. And it took me about 15 years to recover. And in those days, having chronic fatigue was really not something which was acknowledged by the medical community. And we were often called malingerers, or we were very much kind of marginalized by society. And then I was lucky enough to make a complete recovery. For various reasons, which I'll probably have time to explain a little bit about today. And along this journey, I discovered yoga, and yoga made a huge difference and played a major part in my recovery. I was unlucky enough to be bitten by a tick in 2011. And since that time, I now have developed Lyme disease, which means that I still do have quite an intimate experience and relationship with fatigue, but I manage it very much with yoga and I'm able to teach. Generally, I would say that my quality of life isn't too bad, but it does mean that I do have this rather intimate understanding of what fatigue and overwhelm and energy issues can mean. And I also would like to say that for this presentation, I've decided not to use slides. So if you would like to have notes of the presentation, please contact me via my website and I'll be really happy to send you the details. Most of what I am saying this morning is a little bit which is taken from my new book, which is coming out in the autumn, called Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome. That's published by Singing Dragon and is available for pre-order. So I spent 8 years researching that book, so there's a lot in the book, but some of the key points I'm trying to get through today, depending on how time goes. But also because I'm not using slides, it does mean if you've got fatigue issues yourself and you don't want to be looking at a screen all the time, you're really welcome to lie down, close your eyes, and to just listen. So I hope you enjoy what I'm going to say. I really hope it's helpful, because really that's what I'm all about. Is I really want to spread the message of how we can help people, because fatigue and burnout are becoming such huge issues, especially in these times of COVID and overwhelm. And for those of you who are yoga therapists, I'm sure like myself, you are actually beginning to see more and more people with post-COVID fatigue. So I just kind of want to start off with a couple of definitions. Then I'm going to briefly explain some of the science, but not too much, because really to my fingertips, I'm a yogi, so I'm quite keen to get more onto the yoga solutions. But I think it is helpful to do a little bit of the science. And then we'll look at how yoga can help, and maybe as practitioners, how we can help the people that we're working with. So in 1975, the term burnout was first coined by Herbert Freudenberger, and he described it as a state where the body is completely depleted of energy. And interestingly, will usually be running a chronic stress response. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about the stress response here, because I'm presuming that you will understand that. You will know something about the central nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system. And you will, like we all really understand that if we are chronically stressed, we are running a fight and flight mechanism, so that our heart rate might be continuously quite high. We might be having constantly stressed, tense muscles. Our breathing will be fast. Our breathing pattern might be one of hyperventilation. Our thoughts will be fast and anxious. And we're basically on high alert as if there is an emergency about to happen. So he is describing burnout as we are running a chronic stress response, and eventually that will lead to a situation of exhaustion. And I think it's interesting also to look at what the opposite of overwhelm and burnout mean. And to me, it means having resilience. So having energy and a sense of well-being, but also having the ability to recover fast from any conflict or challenge in life. And of course, we need to remember here that some stress is good because it does help to build our resilience during times of challenges. Really, we're talking about overwhelming stress, and there's a lot of it about in this day and age, unfortunately. So when we talk about, I was looking up the definition of overwhelm, and it generally means to be submerged. Often the actual dictionary definition gives overwhelm as being submerged by water. But, you know, overwhelm can be a positive thing. We can talk about being overwhelmed by love, being overwhelmed by joy. But obviously in the context that I'm talking here, I'm talking really about being overwhelmed by life in a way that it's difficult to manage. And it is possible to have overwhelm and to not have burnout or to not have fatigue. But usually if you have fatigue or you have chronic fatigue or you have burnout, then you will become overwhelmed very quickly because this idea of your resilience is lowered. You don't have the resilience to bounce back. And I think before we kind of also go on with the definitions of fatigue, it's also useful to think about how our society sees fatigue. And I think the problem that we have had, and maybe it's good to think that maybe COVID might be changing these perceptions, but as a society, generally, we are valued as being, we're valued for being productive and for working hard. And success, of course, is seen as something which is financial. And success is very tied up with doing and achieving. So consequently, fatigue, particularly chronic fatigue, and burnout are something that are not respected so much in our culture. And because of this, if we do have fatigue or burnout, we tend to distrust the idea of resting or taking breaks or taking time out. It's not something which is so acceptable. And indeed, resting might be equated with being lazy or not worthy or not good enough. So fatigue, chronic fatigue, carries with it a sense of shame, and people are often stigmatized. And I find the people that I work with ME, chronic fatigue syndrome, often have this kind of double whammy, not just of having difficult symptoms, but also feeling that they are marginalized by society. And consequently, because of this, we may have problems in making lifestyle shifts to self-care, because we're still trying to fit in with the society, which is always on the go all the time, always rushed. So I just kind of wanted to set that up before we go into more detail about overwhelm, burnout, and fatigue. So when I talk about chronic fatigue syndrome, I am really talking about anything in which there is fatigue. So that could be fatigue associated with burnout, with chronic stress. That could be fatigue associated with illnesses like fibromyalgia, cancer, heart disease, asthma. I mean, people tend to know me as being more of a specialist in ME, chronic fatigue, but certainly when I was researching for my book, I came across the thesis that all fatigue is due to mitochondrial dysfunction, something I'm going to explain in a minute. So really, anything that I'm saying today is about general long-term fatigue, fatigue that lasts for more than 6 months. So let's have a look now at some of the symptoms of fatigue. So symptoms of fatigue or chronic fatigue tend to be complete exhaustion. So that's an exhaustion where people may find it difficult to work, they may find it difficult to function, and if they do something, they may take several days to recover from. So it's not like a normal tiredness. People with chronic fatigue tend to be overwhelmed by minor challenges. This probably is because the amygdala in the brain is oversensitized, so it tends to get more and more sensitized to stress, so it hypersensitizes to any challenges. Other symptoms include insomnia, difficulty in sleeping. There may be ongoing flu-like symptoms, difficulty in concentration, a feeling of being quite detached from everyday life, something that we'll look at when we come to the Stephen Porges's work on polyvagal theory. People with chronic fatigue and burnout may find themselves being easily irritated. They may have frequent panic attacks. Memory problems are quite common. Aches and pains from chronic inflammation, fibromyalgia are very common too. Depression is quite common, although this tends to be a secondary depression from just having a very difficult condition. There may be secondary mental health issues, a feeling of being helpless, and then a very big one for people with burnout and chronic fatigue syndrome is brain fog and brain fatigue. So I think it's useful if we're a yoga therapist to understand that these are some of the symptoms that we're dealing with, that people may have more energy one day when they come to a session than they have on another day, that symptoms will fluctuate, and that if somebody does too much, particularly if they do too strong a yoga practice, it may take them days, even possibly weeks to recover if they've done too much. So for that reason, we have to work really carefully and make sure that we're not pushing somebody so that we trigger them into a relapse situation. So having kind of set up and explained some of the symptoms, I just want to give some of the theories now about why we might develop burnout or chronic fatigue syndrome from what usually will have developed from running a chronic stress pattern. So I'm going to look at two models this morning. One is Polyvagal Theory from Stephen Porges, and the other one is the Mitochondria. Now, as yoga therapists, you might well know about Polyvagal Theory, so I'm only kind of going to go into it in a small way here, but I think it's really interesting when we compare it to some of the yoga models as well. So Stephen Porges set up Polyvagal Theory, and he sees the autonomic nervous system as a network which monitors our environment to understand what level any threat may be. And that's very interesting, I think, because the people I work with tend to feel that they're not really safe. So they quite highly sensitized. They're kind of always looking out for danger. And he says that the vagus nerve plays a really important part in this. So the vagus nerve is a vital part of the autonomic nervous system, and it's the main nerve of the parasympathetic nervous system. It travels from the brain, wraps itself around the face and neck, comes down to the gut, and it wraps itself around all the major organs of the body, including the heart and the lungs. And it sends information to our organs to sense if there is danger or not. It's fundamentally responsible for bringing the body back to a state of relaxation. So very, very important. It's affected by sound, and particularly mid-range sounds tell us that we're safe. High sound frequencies and low sound frequencies may put us into sympathetic nervous system mode, fight, flight. So we can bring our system back to a state of feeling safe. We can control our vagal tone by using chanting, and also with yoga breathing, with slow breathing. So these are two really important yoga tools, chanting and breathing, that we use in yoga therapy. But I've always been trained that they're very important tools anyway to use in yoga therapy. But when we look at polyvagal theory, we can understand why. It's because they're really helping the vagal tone. They're helping the vagus nerve. So polyvagal theory suggests that there are three main responses to any experience in life. So the first response is the ventral vagal system, which is the rest and relaxation division. So this is about our social interactions. It's about when we feel safe and joyful, how present we are, how able we are to engage successfully with others. It affects our facial expressions. So it's very much concerned with smiling, and also about how we interpret people's faces and their voices. So when we're in ventral vagal system tone, our heart rate is slower, our digestion is more effective. And in this state, we're able to access feelings of empathy, compassion, and this feeling of being connected, which of course is exactly how we want our students to be. So this is the ventral vagal system. This is the optimum that we want. Sympathetic nervous system describes how the are with the fight and flight response, which of course I've just explained, and I think that you will be very familiar with this. So this is when we sense a threat or danger, our heart rate starts to go up, our muscles tense, our breathing becomes faster, blood drains from our major organs to our arms and legs so that we can fight or run fast. So this is our kind of emergency response. And again, this is very much concerned with polyvagal theory. And I think it's worth noting that all of us have a bias towards fear in order to protect ourselves. In other words, it's quite common to be hyper alert, because in the old days of when we were cavemen, we would want to know if there was a threat, if a leaf that was rustling might be a tiger that was about to jump on us. So it tends to put us in this kind of bias towards fear. And then I think polyvagal theory gets really interesting when we look at the third response, which is known as the dorsal vagal system response. So this describes a freeze response. And this may occur from life-threatening situations such as overwhelming stress or trauma. It's a shutdown protective mechanism. And one of the researchers, sorry, my brain's just gone dead, not dead. If we think about an animal that freezes, if it's under threat, it will freeze to save its life. So if it's being attacked, I used to see this, I used to have cats, and I would see that my cat might bring a mouse in, which I'd always try and rescue. But often if the mouse wanted to protect itself from the cat, it would play dead, it would freeze. And this is a response that comes from the parasympathetic nervous system, but it helps us to be safe in times of overwhelming trauma. So it's a shutdown protective mechanism. And it gives us a feeling of being very detached and disassociated from the world, and a feeling of being unreal, as if we're not really in the body. So it's a feeling of numbness, and it can present as a lack of emotion or empathy. Now, polyvagal theory is often talked about in terms of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, or trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. Because it's quite common for students with trauma to swing between dorsal vagal system, this shutdown response, and sympathetic nervous system, which is when they're hyper sensitized and hypervigilant. And what we want to do in our yoga practice is to help somebody back to ventral vagal system, back to the calm feeling of being in the flow, being connected, having empathy, but not too much empathy, but enough to make us connected to other people. So this is often referred to as a window of tolerance. So if our students are swinging between hypervigilance and this shutdown mechanism, we want to try to kind of open them up a bit more so that they can experience more joy and compassion in their lives. It's been my experience that many of the people I work with who have ME and chronic fatigue have actually had trauma in their lives. Not everybody who's had trauma will go on to develop chronic fatigue, I might add, but often people with chronic fatigue will have had some kind of trauma. And consequently, they may well experience this kind of shutdown mode if ever they feel triggered, or they may feel hyper-sensitized equally. So although I'm not kind of an expert in trauma, it's something that interests me and I've studied a lot. And I would say if you are interested in trauma, there are lots of people out there who are talking about trauma. I'm a particular fan of Heather Mason at the Minded Institute, and work like Dr. Peter Levine is brilliant as well. And I think Richard Miller, his work with IRES is also great. But I just think it's interesting that when we're talking about chronic fatigue, it has just been my experience in talking to the various people I've worked with. I probably work with nearly 1,000 people who have chronic fatigue syndrome. Most of them will have had a trauma in their lives, or they may be running a slight post-traumatic stress disorder type of response. The other thing I think is interesting when we look at polyvagal theory is that we can equate it to the gunas, because I think ventral vagal system relates to sattva, this feeling of being light and clear. The sympathetic nervous system, when that's running a response, that clearly relates to rajas, where we're kind of overstimulated and hyperactive and go, 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 and we're kind of hyper alert all the time. And then the dorsal vagal system, this kind of shutdown response, relates to tamas. So I think it's quite interesting how we can relate yoga to science as science evolves. So the second bit of the science that I wanted to talk about today refers to the mitochondria, because I think, again, that's very helpful when we're dealing with these conditions to look at the role of the mitochondria. So the mitochondria are the kind of energy spark of the cell of the body. And in particular, I want to focus on Dr. Robert Naveau. He's a professor of medicine at the University of California. And he suggests that it's how our mitochondria function that is the answer to chronic fatigue and burnout states. And again, fatigue being a spectrum, which includes ME and chronic fatigue syndrome. So his research has shown that as well as producing energy, which is what we expect of the mitochondria are also involved in defending the cells of the body. So if we perceive we're under threat, the mitochondria actually shut down. So he suggests that the more that mitochondria are needed to work in defense mode, the less energy they actually produce. And he calls this the cell danger response, or the CDR. So in conclusion, the more that mitochondria have to defend themselves from something, or us from something, the less energy we have, because cells are caught in repeating loops of incomplete recovery in re-injury, unable to fully heal. And this response, this shutdown response, is triggered by encounters with chemical, physical, or biological threats. And the thesis is the abnormal persistence of the cell danger response lies at the heart of many diseases. So not just fatigue, but including burnout and chronic fatigue states. So what triggers the cell danger response? What will it be that turns our mitochondria off? So I'm just going to read you out a list. And as I say, if you want the notes from this, I'm very happy to email them to you after the presentation. But things like inflammation from chronic stress, emotional and physical stress. But then he also suggests poor diet, overuse of junk food, sugar, caffeine, or alcohol, or a diet too low in essential fats, allergies and sensitivities to food and toxins in the environment. I think toxins in the environment is an interesting one because, of course, our environment is so much more toxic now than it was even 30 years ago. And of course, we're seeing more and more cases of chronic illness. Interestingly, he suggests that reduced oxygen supplies to the cells can cause this cell danger response. And several researchers have suggested that there may be a problem with oxygen uptake in chronic fatigue syndrome. And if you want the references for those, that will be in my book, because I go into that in a lot more detail. Coming back to pollution, that would include things like poison sprayed on our food and heavy metal overload, aldehydes and volatile organic compounds. So those are things like toxins given off by carpets and new furnishings and paint. He also suggests a fermenting gut or an unhealthy microbiome can turn the mitochondria off. Some prescription drugs, interestingly, and then viruses, chronic infections and bacteria such as the Lyme toxins, mold toxins in the atmosphere, overgrowth of parasites, and then electromagnetic fields and radiation exposure. So all of these need to be looked at and addressed before somebody can begin to maybe start to recover. But of course, there are many, many ways in which yoga therapy can help with this. So I'd like to move on now to the yoga model of disease and wellness. And just start by saying that, of course, yoga considers our whole system. It's not just looking at our vagus nerve. It's not just looking at the mitochondria. It's looking at the whole system. And one of the definitions of disease in yoga is that if we're ill, we are disconnected from our inner light. So yoga is seeing us as a whole system, as energy. And I think it's important to say here that yoga also sees us as spiritual beings. And I think, you know, that's very important. That's something that we may like to bring into our practice as well, because as far as I'm concerned personally, I see illness as a way to maybe wake us up spiritually, by which I mean that we may want to look about at becoming free, how we can become free, how we can become free from our attachments, from our attachments and our identifications. So when we look at some of the yoga models, we can look, for example, at the chakras. From my experience, I mean, obviously you can't take one chakra in isolation. We're looking at the whole system. But from my experience, I think I tend to look at the heart chakra, because very often with people who've had a long-term chronic stress, burnout, overwhelm, they tend to shut down the heart chakra because life just seems too difficult. And then they become very protective. And of course, there are ways we can work with heart chakra to help people to open up and to become less protected. And I'm going to talk about samskaras in a minute. So I think that also covers how we can work with the heart chakra. Also the navel and the root chakra, it's our sense of self and our feeling of being connected and our feeling of being here. So I see these as particularly affected in these conditions. I see people, and I think all of us are seeing this, seeing people as being particularly disembodied and not really being in their bodies. So that's something that we really need to work with to help people to come back into their physical beings. And of course we can consider very, you know, as we would as yoga therapists, the Panchamaya kosha. So if we look at the whole of the Panchamaya kosha, I think it's very common that we think, well, you know, in energy problems, we're going to look at the Pranamaya kosha. But I think all levels of the Panchamaya kosha are concerned. And I'm more concerned actually with grantis, which mean a restriction or a knot. So when we're looking at somebody with ME, chronic fatigue, they may have a restriction on any level of the Pancha-Maya-Kosha. So for example, they may have repressed emotions, or they may have some difficulty with thinking. They may be contracted around a particular thought. So that gives an idea of where a grunty or a knot or restriction may be. And if we can help people to become freer, if we can create space around these restrictions and knots, we are helping the whole of the Pancha-Maya-Kosha to become more fluid and more free. Obviously, we are talking about prana. And in my experience, we need to work with the energy of apana first. So it's very much about letting go, releasing and detoxing. And again, in my book, there's a lot more about this. But for this reason, I generally suggest that we work with the exhalation first, because that's to do with the energy of apana. Because prana can be too stimulating if we're just working with the energy of the in-breath, if we're just working with prana. So from my experience, it's more about releasing, undoing the knots, letting go, because then that gives room and space for prana to come into the system. I've already talked about the gunas, how the energy of rajas may be unbalanced and there may be flips from rajas to tamas when we looked at polyvagal theory. So yeah, I think, you know, we need to think of prana as being something that's really precious and we want to nurture it. So therefore we want to be thinking of pratihara. How are we using our senses, or how is our client using their senses? What are we inputting? What is the lifestyle? And I know it sounds like a cliche, but if we're always looking at our smartphone or on Netflix all the time, of course, it's not helping our energy. And as I say, I know that's real cliche and that is not the complete answer. But what is the answer is self-inquiry and who am I? How am I living? What am I inputting into my system? You know, these are all questions to be asked. And then parinama, I think that's important. Parinama meaning change. And one translation of parinama is transformation. And we are in 2020 living in times of incredible change. You know, things are happening so fast. So we want to develop that sense of inner peace and foundation, this sense of coming home to ourselves, so that we have the resilience to deal with the changes that are happening. We need to help our students to resource themselves so that they can cope, we all can cope with this rapid change. So I'm going to look now at some of the strategies for dealing with fatigue and overwhelm and how we can build resilience and well-being. So I'd say the first one is actually recognition. So again, that might sound really obvious, but we want our students to actually begin to develop awareness so they understand if they're in sympathetic dominance or not. And really important is to look at the patterns. What are my patterns, or what are the patterns of the student we're working with? So this is svadhyaya, self-inquiry versus lack of awareness. And this then helps to give us a clue to what the coping mechanisms are. So some of the really common samskaras for somebody, or the people that I work with and myself, are really, you know, full disclosure, this describes me too, are people with chronic fatigue tend to often be people pleasers, somebody who pushes through and has this sense of being on the go all the time, somebody who's quite worried about expectations of other people, somebody who's a doer and a type A person, and I'm the classic type A person, somebody who might be quite ambitious, striving all the time, might be a perfectionist. And really key here, people with chronic fatigue syndrome tend not to have much self-compassion, can be very self-critical. And again, this is something that I think we can really help our clients with by encouraging them to accept. And that might just be in Shavasana, getting people to accept their physical sensations, accept their emotions as they arise. This is so important, you know, and again, it forms quite a big part of my book, Self-Compassion. Somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome quite often would like to take care of others and also will have poor boundaries. And I'd just like to give an example, personal example here. I was looking after my husband until recently, he had cancer, and he actually died last December. And it was a very difficult time for both of us. And during his illness, he had lots of difficult treatments, but he became quite verbally aggressive. And I'm not blaming him in any way. It was extremely difficult for him. And of course, I mean, many carers will say this, he took this out on me. And I'm somebody who has difficulty with self-compassion, with my own boundaries. So I kind of took all this. But eventually, after about 3 years, it got so bad that I decided I'd had enough and that I was leaving him. And I went to stay with my mother. And I have to say, my mother, I love her to pieces. So this is not in any way a criticism, but this is just explaining how our patterns can be harmful to us and how seeing the root of our patterns can be really helpful and healing. So I said to my mother, well, you know, I've had enough, I'm going to leave. And my mother said to me, you can't do that. It's your duty. You have to take care of him. I'm sorry, but absolutely not. You have to go back. And I said, well, yeah, but Mum, I understand that he's very ill, but I'm not well either. And what about me? To which my mother's response was, well, you don't count. Now, this was a real insight for me. And it also has quite a happy ending. So I'm not blaming my mother at all for this, but this gave me, after some self-inquiry, I had the insight that this is the root of my patterns of having poor boundaries and people pleasing and taking care of others. And that actually this really was a time to take care of myself. And I could only come to that conclusion with this insight. So what then happened was I did go back, but I moved in with a friend around the corner. So I then took care of Alan, my husband, every day. I'd go in every day for 8 hours, and then I'd go back and stay with my friend Ruth. What this gave me was a sense of taking care of myself, self-care. It gave me a boundary. It meant I had more compassion for myself, but it also meant that Alan really respected me and that our relationship became so much better because of this. And at the end, we had this incredibly healing, beautiful connection. So the point of my story is not necessarily to overshare about myself, but just to say that it's really important to look at our patterns, our samskaras, because sometimes these might make us ill. Sometimes they're not helpful to us, and we need to see what the root is. And if we're working with clients, we want to help them to see what the root of their pattern is, because that often will be a trigger for healing to happen. So looking at some of the tools then that we can work with our clients, I've already mentioned that we need a kind of somatic approach of grounding and being really embodied, and also helping our students to be more present, to be here now, to let go of outcome, so that it's not about if I'm going to be ill tomorrow or next week, it's about how I am now. It's also helping to set up a safe space and to help our student to feel that they are safe themselves, they're safe in their body. And again, I mentioned this idea of working on self-compassion, really, really important. Clearly, we want to be working on mindful, healthy breathing, and I would suggest that's focusing on the exhalation, and that breathing is fundamental to controlling our nervous system. And we need regular checking. I mean, I just mentioned that I was a carer for 5 years. It was stressful, and I found as a yoga practitioner it really helpful to check in 3 or 4 times a day, because my breathing sometimes I would go into hyperventilation. We want to encourage our students to keep things simple and consider what it is we're inputting into our system. We want to encourage our students to pace themselves. And to do this, I quite often when I'm working one-to-one, I will get my student to rest between each asana if I'm working on asana. And then I'll talk to them about the importance of doing this off the mat, so that what they're doing on the mat, this kind of pacing, resting in between postures, they can take off the mat. And then something I find really important when working with people is to encourage lots of silence. People we work with may find it very difficult to be alone with the mind. And I think, you know, we want to encourage them that it's okay to be alone. They might only want to do this in small bits initially, but silence is so healing, and it is the route to freedom. It's who we are. So I think silence for me is one of my most important yoga tools. And although I've been doing a lot of talking for this presentation, when I'm teaching, I do incorporate a lot of silence. I try not to talk too much. Clearly, deep rest and relaxation is important. Encouraging people that it's okay to take rests. I actually do a yoga nidra myself at least once a day. Practicing mindfulness is, of course, really important because that helps us to be in the moment. And then I'd just like to look a bit more at some kind of nervous system, what I call nervous system yoga hacks, what else we can communicate. I find a lot of people with chronic fatigue syndrome are empaths. And that means, although we want the heart to be open, they might be too empathetic. So it's a matter of helping them to have the balance. Yes, we want to be empathetic towards others, but we need this empathy to ourselves as well. So that's important. I also think it's important that we share with people that tiredness is actually a really honourable cue to rest, and that we shouldn't suppress our tiredness. If we're feeling tired, or we're feeling grotty, or we've got lots of difficult symptoms, please rest out, don't push through. We can maybe help our students with boundaries, the idea of discrimination about what we take on, about when we say no to something, and remembering that we have to drink before we can pour. In other words, we have to look after ourselves before we give to others. And remembering that self-care is important and it's okay. Taking care of ourselves is also honourable. Taking micro breaks is important. Resting between activities, taking pauses during the day, not just striving and pushing through. I've put in my notes hugging, touching and softly stroking. This is because it really helps the parasympathetic nervous system when we hug and touch. So I do quite a lot of work with my students that we can actually do now. So like I would do, if you take your left hand and place it on your forehead and your right hand just cradle the base of the spine. These are called Somatic Holes. So I could just hold around the face and maybe take 5 breaths. Hold the heart, hold the head. These are all things that can help. We can stroke the arms, encourage the students to do some self-stroking. And also remembering that soft voices make us feel safe. And encouraging our students at all times to be real and authentic, you know, letting go of pretending and pleasing or trying to be something we're not, living our true dharma, being authentic. Processing emotions properly, allowing ourselves time to feel rather than suppressing and avoiding uncomfortable feelings. So again, I encourage my students to sit, allowing what comes up to be without going into a story of the mind about it, without pushing it away, without acting it out. And of course, if there's trauma, we have to be very careful with this. And then finally, acceptance, trying to encourage our student to accept the state of being as it is. So I'd just like to finish by thanking you so much for being here, and also just finishing with a practice that I use. So this is a practice which combines chanting, mantra and pranayama. So if you like to take a mudra, so here I'm using I'm going to use Nadi Shodhana. So we're going to take Mrigi Mudra. So just please connect your index finger and your middle finger into your palm of your hand. Take the little finger and ring finger together. We're going to use the thumb to block the right nostril and the ring finger and left and index finger to block, we're going to use the thumb to block the right nostril and the little finger and ring finger to block the left. So we inhale through both nostrils, close the right nostril and exhale left. Inhale right. And now drop the hand to the heart and we're going to chant Shanti. Shanti. Inhale left. Drop the hand to the heart and chant Shanti. Inhale right. Drop the hand to the heart. Shanti. Twice more in your own breathing rhythm. Shanti. Shanti. When you're ready, drop the hand to your knee. Just close your eyes if they're not closed already. Just sit for a few minutes, feeling the vibration of the mantra. Feeling the stillness. And then when you're ready, open your eyes. Just like to thank you all so much for joining me. Thank you. I'm Shanti. And just to say again that if you would like the notes from this presentation, if you visit my website, which is www.fionaagombar.co.uk, and you contact me, I'll be really happy to send you the notes. And also there are details on there about my upcoming book, Yoga Therapy for Stress, Burnout and Chronic Fatigue Syndrome, which has much more information in there than I could explain today, including the practices. So thank you all again so much, and I look forward to maybe being in contact with you at some point. Thank you.